Today, I'm going to talk about grandparents' experience of being alienated from their grandchildren. And I'm going to talk specifically about some research that we conducted in the Family and Interpersonal Relationships Lab at the University of Tasmania and the research and the findings that we had from that research. So, the aim of the research that we conducted was to explore what life is like for grandparents who have limited or no contact with their grandchildren as a result of being exposed to parental alienating behaviours. So it was a relatively small study. We interviewed 12 alienated grandparents, and although the sample size is small, it was a good sample size for qualitative research, and we did find a lot of rich information from the interviews. So for this particular study, the grandparents were alienated from their grandchildren because of exposure to parental alienating behaviours, and the alienation occurred because the grandparents or the participants' sons and daughters were being alienated from their own children. So we were really looking at that intergenerational transmission of parental alienation. We also acknowledge that some grandparents are alienated from their grandchildren for other reasons, but for this study, we were just looking at that intergenerational pattern. So our participants were aged between 62 and 74 years. The vast majority were living in Australia, and the majority were grandmothers. And on average, our participants were alienated from 2 grandchildren, and the average age of the grandchildren was just under 15 years of age. So, following on from the interviews, we analysed the data semantically, and I'm now going to summarise the main findings. So, essentially, what we found was that the grandparents who we interviewed were exposed to a lot of the same alienating behaviours that targeted parents have reported experiencing, and that also adult alienated children who have been interviewed later on in life have reported having experienced in their childhood. So the grandparents we interviewed talked about how there was emotional manipulation or gatekeeping occurring in the family even before the family separated. And so they found that the alienating parent tended to try to isolate the child even before family separation, would interfere with the transmission of information about the child, and also would tightly control contact and family relationships and dynamics. So our participants actually were able to articulate that parental alienating behaviours sometimes occur before the family separation occurred. Many of our participants also reported being on the receiving end of false allegations of various things, normally false allegations of abuse or violence that were found to be unsubstantiated and not true. They also talked about the brainwashing that they saw occurring with their grandchildren and how that influenced the grandchildren's behaviour. They talked about the tightly controlled contact. So either that contact was so controlled that they no longer had contact with their grandchildren, or when they did have contact with their grandchildren, that contact was so tightly controlled and had so many conditions on it that it was incredibly stressful to do, not only for the grandparents, but also for the grandchildren. And some of our participants talked about how it became too distressing, and as a result, they then had to withdraw contact for their well-being and also for the well-being of the grandchild. And some of the participants also spoke about how that tightly controlled contact created some tension between them and their own child, so the parent of the child who was alienated, and then that made that too difficult for them to continue the contact. And that occurred in instances where the targeted parent of the child was not having contact with the child. They talked about the emotional manipulation strategies that were being used against the child and against themselves, and also against the participant's own child. They discussed the banning of information and how information about the child wasn't being transmitted to them, and also information that they might want to get to their grandchild wasn't being transmitted back. So there was basically an information block. They described denigration and how they had been denigrated and their name had been slandered. They talked about how their own child's name had been slandered. And they also talked about the interrogation of the child and times that they knew about where, if they had had contact with the child, that the child would then be interrogated by the alienating parent about what had occurred. Many of our participants described being on the receiving end of threatening correspondence from the alienating parent. And so they had been threatened with all kinds of things. And so some of those threats were about various types of legal action if they didn't stop trying to make contact with their grandchild. But sometimes that threatening correspondence actually went a little bit further, and there were threats to life were made as an ultimate way of controlling the grandparents' behaviours. Some of our grandparents talked about secret keeping, and so that was times where they might have had contact with their grandchild, but then if they wanted to maintain that contact, they needed to keep that a secret from their own child, which was quite problematic. There was also social media blockout, and so that was when the grandparents attempted to contact the grandchild through social media, but those attempts were blocked, so it wasn't possible to do that. They also talked about how the alienating parent would encourage the child to be disrespectful towards them. And grandparents found this particularly difficult, particularly when they had a previously positive relationship with the child. Suddenly, this child was not as they remembered them. And then, of course, there was the experience of rejecting gifts and cards. So when they would try to give birthday presents, Christmas presents from them, they would be blocked, they would be returned. So all of these types of behaviours are behaviours that not only experienced by the grandparents, but previous research has shown that these behaviours are experienced by targeted parents themselves. And also at the centre of all of this is a child who is being emotionally manipulated and abused and being blocked from people who love them and care for them and want to be in their lives. So then we had a look at the impacts of being alienated from a grandchild and being exposed to parental alienating behaviours. And our largest finding was the grief that they experienced. And the grief was multi layered. So not only were they experiencing their own grief for their losses, but they were grieving for their grandchildren and the losses that they have had and the losses that their grandchildren will have, not having had a relationship with them, their parent, so the targeted parent, and also the great grandparent. So they grieved for their own parents. So when our participants had a grandparent, so had a parent themselves, so the child's great grandparent, they were grieving for the fact that the grandchildren may not ever get to know the great grandparent before they die. They also worried about the child not having a relationship with themselves, as in the participants of the study, before they die. And they also really worried for the losses that their own children were suffering as a result of this. So their grief was just multi layered. And then, of course, there was the other types of grief and loss that are associated with parental alienation. And so that loss of the grandparenting role, that loss of being able to just have a relationship with a grandchild and do all the fun things that grandparents and grandchildren do. which then leads to the losses. So they talked a lot about the loss of relationship between the grandparent and grandchild and how that was multi-layered. So it's a loss of relationship, the loss of relationship that they had, the loss of relationship that they could have. Then, of course, there's that loss of that knowledge transmission. So grandparents are a wealth of knowledge, and knowing that the knowledge, the family history, the stories of the family are not going to get passed down to that next generation. Then there were social losses. So having friends who are grandparents and engage in social activities and not being able to participate in those because they don't have the relationship with their own grandchildren to come along. But also when they had social activities in their own family, knowing that there's a really important member of the family or members of the family missing was a big loss for them too. Grandparents spoke about financial losses because many of them had actually funded the legal battles of their child for their own child to have access to their child, so the alienated child. And they spoke about having spent so much of their money and so much of their retirement funds that they were no longer in a position to leave a financial legacy to their own child and their grandchild. Some of our participants had also lost their careers. They'd either lost their careers through the denigration and the false allegations, or they'd lost their careers because they'd taken early retirement in order to take care of their own child through all of this distressing mess. So there were many losses for grandparents. They also spoke about the impacts of all of this grief and loss on them. And they spoke about the emotional toll that it was taking on them because they were not only trying to look after themselves, they were also trying to care for the targeted parent, so their own child, and make sure that their own child was coping okay. And often, as many parents and grandparents do, they were putting the needs of their own child first above their own. So that had quite an important impact on their own mental health, and they described how their mental health had suffered as a result. They also talked about how the stress had impacted on their immune systems and that they were experiencing significant physical health difficulties too, which they attributed to that prolonged exposure to stress and distress. They spoke about the impact that all of this had on their sleep and how many of them were experiencing sleep difficulties because they were awake, worrying. And then there were feelings of helplessness and feelings of anger, anger that this can happen, and anger that there were very little support services that they can go to try and resolve all of the difficulties. And there was a lot of anger directed at the family court system and how ineffective they considered the family court system to be to act in these situations. The grandparents also spoke about the different ways that they tried to cope with what they were experiencing. So some of them had actually reached out for uh, psychological support, and so they saw their own psychologists or counsellors, and they found that beneficial. They also were leaning into their own social supports. So most of the time, there were other family members who had an understanding of the situation, but for some of them, they were relying on friends. And so the people who had good social supports in place tended to fare a little better than those who didn't. Some grandparents had to suppress what they were feeling. They had to put their needs and their difficulties aside in order to focus on the needs of their own child. And so there were people who just said, I can't focus on my experience, I can't deal with my experience, I have to look after my own child at this point in time. For some grandparents, they coped by simply accepting that this is the situation, that they can't change it. So I guess this is a type of radical acceptance that there was nothing more that they can do, and so that they needed to just find a way to live their life with the current situation occurring. Some parents, however, had trouble doing that. The grandparents, some grandparents talked about how they would overthink their past behaviour. They would ruminate on past experiences. They would think about, did I do that wrong? Did I say that right? Did I put my foot wrong? And they would just basically distress themselves overthinking past experiences. Another really productive way of coping or adaptive way of coping was learning about parental alienation. So some of our grandparents spoke about how they learnt about it, that they found some comfort in knowing that it was actually a thing and that they were not the only ones experiencing it, and that they were the ones who took that information and that language that you are not alone feeling to their own children, and that provided some support for their own children, just knowing that there is a thing called parental alienation. Some grandparents, as part of their radical acceptance of the situation, found ways to justify why they were having no contact. And that was particularly important for the grandparents who had chosen to withdraw from the tightly controlled, conditional contact they were having with their grandchildren, that they justified it, that it was too distressing for their grandchild and too distressing for them. And also, it was not okay that they have this contact, but their own child can't have contact with the grandchild. And then there were other strategies that participants spoke about, and these mostly consisted of mindfulness based strategies to cope and to manage their, to, I guess, to calm down their nervous systems during this distressing time, and engaging in hobbies and engaging in other strategies that basically provided some distraction and light relief from the distress that they were managing. Our grandparents spoke about the future. Some spoke with some optimism and some hope, and some were unable to do that. So some spoke about how they thought that it was too late now, that they had lost their grandchild, and that they most likely wouldn't be able to reunify. They had fears for the future of their grandchild and the impact that all of the alienation was having on them and the alienating behaviours was having on them, and feared for what kind of adult they would become and what sort of trauma they would have to deal with. Some spoke about hope for reunification, and they hoped that in time, and perhaps when the child was a bit older, that they might be able to have contact with their grandchild. But they all hoped that their grandchild somehow knew that they were loved, and that they could feel that in some way. I did touch on this earlier, but a really key finding was that prioritization of the targeted parent, so their own child and their own child's needs. They talked about the nature of support that they provided, and for some of our grandparents, that support was quite high. So the grandparents that we interviewed, some of them spoke about how their own child, as a result of this experience, were experiencing suicidal thoughts, and that they were essentially supporting their own child to stay alive in all of this situation. So for some, their support was very high, and for some, it was day to day support. So just helping their own child get out of bed and face the day while they were managing their own grief. And for some, it was just providing emotional support as someone else who knows and understands the situation. And they spoke about the impacts of supporting the their own child through this experience and how hard it was for them to see their own child suffer. There was a lot of conversation in our interviews from the grandparents about their injustices. So they felt quite angry that grandparents didn't have enough rights or legal rights to be able to use in order to maintain a relationship with their grandchildren. They were really frustrated with the court and how they were essentially blocked out of those court processes because they didn't have legal rights that could be enforced through a legal process. They were also really frustrated with how the court process, as they saw it, had caused further trauma to not only themselves but to their own children. So, a lot of anger directed at the family court system. And also, they really felt the injustice of others' um, inaccurate assumptions of their wrongdoing. That if you're not having a relationship with your grandchild, then you must have done something wrong, when that couldn't be further from the truth. So they really struggled with assumptions that other people make who don't know about parental alienation. Some of them then talked about the meaning that they attached to their experience. They talked about how, well, they likened the experience for the child to cult-like behavior. So they likened the alienating parent to like a cult leader who was able to essentially control um, the people in their lives and orchestrate interactions and communications exactly the way they wanted it, in the same way that cult leaders can do that. And that has been discussed in the literature as well in the past. And so their descriptions of their experience of trying to navigate alienating behaviours and the behaviours of the alienating parent was quite consistent with that literature, likening parental alienating behaviours to cult-like behaviours. Um, and they also reflected on the alienating parent's behaviours, and they reflected on how hard it must be for someone, that someone being the alienating parent, to have so much anger and rage and desire to control the world, and how they must be hurt people who are then hurting other people. And so there were a lot of deep reflections on that, and a lot of good insight into the dynamics of parental alienating behaviours. Overall, what we found with this small but important study, and important because it's an area of research that still needs a lot of work, is that there is this clear intergenerational pattern. So it's not just a relationship that's severed between a child and their parent, it is relationships that are severed right up and along the family tree. And that trauma extends itself right deep into the family tree. And so I think this small study provides some useful information that shows the importance of the need to address parental alienating behaviours early, so that we can try and prevent this trauma from happening from so many people. So if you have any questions about our research, um, I think that my contact details are provided, and feel free to contact me.